Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Plattner, the co-director of the National Endowment for Democracy's, the Research Council of the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies, and the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. And it's a very special pleasure for me today to introduce as the speaker my longtime friend Ladan Boroumand, who's currently a Reagan-Fascell Fellow here at NED. If any of you should be unfamiliar with the Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellows Program, I can tell you that it hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research or to pursue other projects at NED. Now in its 18th year, the program has hosted more than 290 fellows from over 90 countries since its founding in 2001. Ladan is the co-founder with her sister Roya, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, she's abroad, but they co-founded the Ladan Boroumand Center for the Promotion of Human Rights and Democracy in Iran, a non-governmental organization that's been an NED grantee for many years. The Boroumand Center promotes human rights awareness in Iran through education and the dissemination of information. It's best known as the home of Endowment, a remarkable website that documents human rights abuses committed by the Islamic Republic and that memorializes its victims. Ladan's had a number of other ties with NED. She's a member both of the Research Council of the International Forum and of the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy, to which she's regularly contributed articles on Iran. And she also currently serves on the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy. A historian who received her doctorate at France's École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, she is the author of the book La Guerre des Principes, published in 1999, which examines the tensions between human rights and national sovereignty during the French Revolution. She's published articles on both the French Revolution and Iran's Islamic Revolution, as well as on the moral, political, intellectual, and spiritual roots of Islamist terrorism. As you know, this month marks the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Discussions of Iran here in Washington tend to focus on foreign policy concerns, the nuclear issue, sanctions, Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, and the like. But as a consequence, we often fail to pay sufficient attention to what's happening inside the country, even though domestic developments are likely to have a greater impact on the future of the Islamic regime than our international factors. The title of today's talk refers to the, quote, crisis of legitimacy in Iran. Now, legitimacy is a somewhat slippery concept, and social scientists continue to debate its meaning and its sources. But we do know that regimes that seem quite solid can suddenly lose their legitimacy, as happened to the Soviet Union, with devastating consequences. Ideological factors that may appear quite theoretical can come to have very practical political effects. Ladan carefully studies ideological trends in the Islamic Republic, but she also has a detailed knowledge of what's happening inside the country, including what people of all sorts are saying and thinking. And as a result, she brings to the analysis of Iran a perspective that's often lacking among other students of the Islamic Republic. You may have noticed on your seats when you came in that she has very kindly prepared a glossary of terms to help listeners understand what otherwise might seem to be arcane references in our talk. So I'm now going to turn the floor over to Ladan, who will speak for about 35 minutes, is that right? Following which I'll pose a few questions to her before we invite members of the audience to join the discussion. Those of you who are on Twitter can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDevents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the Endowment at NE Democracy. And if you've not already done so, please take a moment to join me in silencing your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members here at NED who've been involved with preparing this event, and most especially Research Associate Jeremy Langlois, who's offered vital assistance to the fellowship project and to today's presentation.
Thank
Ladan?
you so much, Mark. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank NED, of which we have been a grantee for many, many years for our foundation, but also to which I have had intellectual tie for very long time. And it's within NED that I have been able to develop my basically intellectual itinerary towards understanding the Islamic Republic of Iran. I would like also to thank Sally Blair, actually the soul of the Reagan-Fascell Fellowship. I met her when she started this fellowship, and she has made created an extraordinary logistic for activists and scholars who want to work on a subject or think about their fight and struggle for freedom. This fellowship is amazing because it provides you total freedom on the subject you want to work and very supportive framework to be able to enable you to do it. And it's pretty rare, I must say. I know she's leaving the fellowship, but I know that there is a very valuable heir to her legacy, Xerxes Spencer, whom I thank too. I thank also my associate fellow, a young, brilliant man. I think he will have a brilliant career in academia. And the rest of the team of the fellows and everybody at NED, I am grateful forever. I hope you have taken a look at the glossary, because for those of you who are not familiar with Islamic culture or Iran, I think it could be helpful. 40 years ago this month, a cleric emerged on the Iranian and world stages, advocating an unprecedented theopolitical project that resulted in the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran. The regime turned 40 this month and is now facing manifold challenges, including ideological ones. To explore these ideological challenges, let us recall the ideology that informed the old Ayatollah's revolutionary zeal. Khomeini claimed that Islam's holy book, the Quran, and its prophetic tradition, the Sunnah, contains legislation as well as political, social, cultural, and economic programs for all human societies at all times. He also declared that God has designated the Islamic jurisprudent, the faqih, as the successor to the prophet in all matters, including in government matters. He affirmed that the faqih is entitled to enforce God's laws upon Muslim communities and promote them in non-Muslim societies. He conceived his theopolitical project to redress the corruption of westernized Muslim societies and establish the government of God on earth. He denied Iranian national identity and replaced the concept of Iranian nation with the concept of the Islamic Ummah. The cornerstone of his theopolitical project was the Velayat Faqih, which means the guardianship of the Islamic jurisprudent. Velayat Faqih assigns the status of minor to citizen and denies people's sovereignty. In traditional religious teachings, Velayat Faqih applied to some specific social issues, such as the lives of mentally handicapped citizens or orphans. This guardianship had little in common with the political system promoted by the revolutionary Ayatollah. The vast majority of Shia Grand Ayatollah had rejected and still reject his interpretation and refused to extend the authority of the clergy beyond believers' ethical and religious duties. Khomeini's genius consisted in taking this controversial judicial prerogative and amalgamating it with two other elements: a modern revolutionary tradition inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideology, and the mystical Sufi tradition, which endows the master with an absolute power to guide his follower on a spiritual journey towards the ultimate truth. Such an amalgam would not have succeeded without jurisprudential sophistry and a religious usurpation. Through jurisprudential sophistry, Khomeini perverted the velayat from a limited civil prerogative into an extended absolute political prerogative. To the dismay of the traditional religious establishment, he not only promoted political Islam, but also usurped the title of Imam, which in Shia tradition is exclusively reserved to the 12 infallible and immaculate descendants of the Prophet. Through this usurpation, he transformed the mystical individual relation between a chosen spiritual master and his follower into a political system calling for the obedience of the people to a charismatic leader. The combination of these disparate elements into a new and somehow modern totalitarian ideology helped Khomeini mobilize a range of political, religious, and social groups whose aspirations and ideologies were fundamentally different and rather contradictory. Young revolutionary youth, inspired by Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Frantz Fanon, or the Algerian Revolution, found in Khomeini a steadfast leader fighting for social justice and against Western imperialism and capitalism. Lower-ranking Shia clerics saw in him a chance to upgrade their social status while restoring the fading authority of religion over a modernizing society. Middle-class dissenters pictured him as a man who would fight corruption and bring freedom while countervailing communism. As for traditional liberal nationalist forces, they looked at him as a convenient instrument able to unite the nation, hasten the removal of the Shah, restore the rule of law, and bring about Iran's independence from foreign powers. The lower classes, who had been slow to join the movement, finally rallied Khomeini as the Imam, the long-awaited savior who would improve their living conditions and guarantee their salvation. Even the imperial army ended up joining the Islamic Revolution with the benediction of the US allies. While the Ayatollah's followers were fantasizing who he was and what he would do for them, he himself clearly articulated his goal as his goal was primarily moral and spiritual rather than economic and social. "We will make you reach the status of human being," he promised to his people. The denial of the free-willed autonomous individual and the ambition of creating a new Homo Islamicus in a purified society was the very core of Khomeini's mission and defined its modern totalitarian character. From the moment he designated a provisional government, he officially claimed a divine mandate and assigned a secondary role to people's will. To the people whose sovereignty he robbed, Khomeini promised a purified society where Islamic tenets prevail, a corruption-free, prosperous, worldly life, and above all, salvation in the afterlife. The constitution he and his allies crafted for Iran established an absolutist regime in which, under the direct authority of the unelected supreme leader, the army, security forces, justice system, and state media are denied any independence. Through a system of filtering candidates and vetoes, the elections have been perverted into a co-optation mechanism that regulates a limited competition within the ruling oligarchy. While this rapid consolidation of power occurred, the spectacle of millions of Iranians from all walks of life pouring onto the streets to welcome their charismatic leader in 1979, images of tens of thousands of children and old people volunteering for martyrdom during the 8-year-long war against Iraq, and the sight of millions of fervent followers mourning the Ayatollah's death in June 1989 confirmed for those following Iranian affairs the image of a nation of fervent believers attached to the religious regime with its deep roots in their cultural heritage. How is the Islamic regime ideology faring 30 years after the passing of its founder? In March 1979, 98.2% of the population voted in support of the Islamic Republic. What would be the result of a similar referendum today? Since the late 1980s, oppositionist civil society activists and demonstrators have time and again asked for a referendum, but the Islamic regime is not enthusiastic about the idea. So we have to resort to other available indicators to examine this question. In the absence of independent polling, many policy experts see no other choice than resorting to the evidence offered by elections. However, elections may be a treacherous indicator. After all, how reliable can they be when they are notoriously unfair and unfree, with unverifiable participation rates and results? In Iran, as in any post-totalitarian regime, intimidation and violence are the main axis of interaction between the government and society. And the target of state violence is the very space where society's reaction to theocratic rule can be captured and analyzed. As a student of political history who has been watching state violence since 1982, I have learned that monitoring and documenting state violence are not only a moral and humanitarian necessity, they are also an epistemological requirement. So let us consider state violence as an indicator, and remember that the establishment of a revolutionary tribunal with no investigation, no lawyer, no appeal, no due process was the first institutional act taken by the Ayatollah after his victory. The Islamic Revolutionary Tribunal enthroned a vengeful God, a destroyer of arrogance, hitherto unknown to most Iranians. Though acting in the name of a resentful God, this instrument of terror and intimidation was not inspired by any canon law, Islamic canon law, and had no precedent in the Prophet's tradition. It was in fact directly inspired by the modern revolutionary tradition that the Ayatollah had incorporated into his syncretic ideology. As they had denied the legitimacy of the Velayat Faqih, most Grand Ayatollah condemned the behavior of this tribunal openly or privately, depending on their courage. By the end of 1985, after thousands of summary executions and thousands more of extrajudicial killings, all pre-revolutionary political forces were dismantled, and their leaders or militants were either executed, imprisoned, or in exile. Nearly 2 million among the most active and educated of the country's citizens had left Iran. The majority of Grand Ayatollahs who disapproved of political Islam were either silenced, in house arrest, or defrocked by a special clerical court for promoting an American Islam. Please keep the phrase American Islam in mind. We will get back to it. Khomeini's cultural project was implemented through violent militias and paramilitary forces. The private sphere of citizen lives was routinely assaulted by morality police. a vast program of expropriation of wealthy citizens along with the nationalization of financial institutions and industrial conglomerates transformed Iran into a social economy. The peaceful transition of power after Khomeini's death in June 1989 proved, at least on the surface, that as unorthodox and almost heretical as it was, the new Islamist ideology was strong enough to survive its charismatic inventor. Was this Islamist ideology as strong as it appeared? Or were censorship, state violence, and the propaganda of a state-controlled media creating an optical illusion? The state gruesome project of extrajudicial killings launched in the late 1980s points to another reality. This program of mass murder, which by the late 1990s had claimed the lives of over 3,000 political prisoners, several hundred intellectual dissidents, as well as exiled oppositionists, seemed to belie the regime's ideological self-confidence. At first sight, the second surge in state violence was inexplicable. Why would the regime feel threatened by defeated oppositionists, peaceful, powerless poets and writers, scholars of ancient Iran, non-violent, isolated nationalist leader, Christian priest, Baha'i citizens? What connected the victims was that, claiming their freedom of conscience, they had openly refused to become the ideal Homo Islamicus. Their very existence reflected not the political, but the ideological defeat of the regime. The reason they were so subversive was that at the time, the regime was in fact facing a two-pronged ideological crisis. Hardly a decade into the Islamic regime's existence, the Leninist component of the regime's ideology, meaning its socialist revolutionary character, was seriously in crisis. This was not only because socialist economy do not deliver, but more importantly, because glasnost and perestroika in the USSR had started to shatter the ideological certitudes of the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, those who had the upper hand in the administration of the country during the first decade of the Islamic Republic's history. The left wing of the Islamist ideologues feared the ideological outcome of what was going on in the USSR. Ayatollah Khomeini echoed this fear in a January 1989 letter to Mikhail Gorbachev. In this letter, he warned the Soviet leader not to resort to Western solutions for remedying communism's economic and social problems. The real problem, he reminded Gorbachev, does not concern private property, economics, and liberty. Please note liberty. Your real problem, wrote the Ayatollah, is the same as what had led the West to an impasse. Your real problem was the result of your long and vain fight against God. Today, communism is no more in the world. I seriously ask you to avoid being trapped in the Western and great Satan's prison. Ironically, Khomeini never felt compelled to write to the Soviet leadership while they were waging war against God. But he felt endangered by the USSR adopting the Western worldview. Lack of liberty, he reminded Gorbachev, is not what doomed communism. What destroyed communism, it was denying liberty in the name of historical materialism. In Khomeini's letter, the West and the great Satan referred neither to countries nor to specific policies, but to a worldview, namely the liberal democratic worldview, the one that defines man as an autonomous, free-willed being. Now we can explain why Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari was defrocked on charge of promoting American Islam. As an ultra-traditionalist Ayatollah, there was nothing American about him, except his defense of people's sovereignty and his rejection of the Vilayat-e-Faqih. We said the regime was facing a two-pronged ideological crisis. The second and most crucial threat concerned the religious dimension of the ideology, the very definition of man in Islamic worldview, the jurisprudential sophistry of the Velayat Faqih, and the religious usurpation of the status of immaculate and infallible imam. Critical work against the Ayatollah's revolutionary Islam had started from day one within traditional circles of Shia religious seminaries. From the mid-1980s, disillusioned revolutionary clerics and Islamist intellectuals set out to deconstruct Khomeini's ideology. What distinguishes this new cohort of religious critics from their traditionalist, quietist predecessor is that they all have a modern philosophical and scientific educational background in addition to their religious training. An important contribution came from Mehdi Ha'eri Yazdi, the son of the founder of the Holy City of Qom's religious seminary and a prestigious cleric opposed to Khomeini's political Islam from the very beginning. In a book published in 1995 in the West, Ha'eri deconstructs Khomeini's terminological sophistry and invalid religious argumentation. Inspired by his work on the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and by his own classical understanding of Quranic teaching, he restores the free-willed and autonomous individual as a necessary postulate, both for Islam as a religion and as the foundation of the body politics. An even more devastating blow to the regime's ideology had come 7 years earlier in 1988 from one of the protagonists of Islamic cultural revolution, the Islamic public intellectual Abdul Karim Soroush. Soroush argued that although religious truth in itself is endowed with a perennial and eternal character, human understanding of religion is contingent upon human needs and knowledge of the time. Therefore, the interpretation of religious texts constitutes a man-made system of knowledge that is subject to change, just like any other man-made body of knowledge. Soroush rejects the validity of Velayat Faqih and also questions the clergy's monopoly of interpreting religion. Another reformist theologian, former revolutionary cleric Mohsen Kadivar, argues that the Quran is not a book of law, rather it contains spiritual guidance, and the Prophet's tradition contains mainly ethical guidelines. According to Kadivar, the scripture and prophetic tradition had two goals: giving guidelines for a happy life and managing the religious life at the time of the establishment of Islam. The former is permanent. The latter is temporal, regardless of whether it is in scripture or tradition. To oppose the regime resentful and violent God, Kadivar has coined the expression of merciful Islam, which acknowledges the individual's complete freedom of thought and conscience and prohibits any punishment for blasphemy or apostasy in this world. Kadivar is the initiator of structural ijtihad with the aim of distinguishing between permanent and temporal Islamic ordinances. Structural ijtihad keeps the permanent doctrine and teachings, and as Kadivar says, sends the remainder to the museum of the history of Islam. This is exactly what another theologian, Mujtahid Shabestari, had wished for in his critique of the official reading of religion, published in 2002. A former advocate of political Islam, he lamented that in its current state, Islamic canon law is devoid of the intellectual instrument required for distinguishing between what is eternal and what is changeable in religion. For Shabestari, the meaning of perfection of religion is not that it contains everything under the sun. It is not perfection for a religion to function as a substitute for science, technology, and human deliberation. And while in the early 2000s, Kadivar and Soroush were still hanging onto a utopian Islamic democracy, Shabestari struck another decisive blow against the regime's theopolitical ideology through his defense of the modern concept of individualism, democracy, and human rights. Regardless of their absence in Islamic sources, he wrote, they best serve the idea of natural justice, which is the highest goal of the body politics in Islamic teachings. The failure of Khatami's reformist presidency to achieve real reforms and the defeat of the 2009 Green Movement, the last collective effort to find an Islamism with humane face, convinced Soroush and Kadivar of the illusory character of a religious democracy. Now in exile, they both promote secular liberal democracy in the name of Islam. These reformers' views differ on important theological issues, but over the years, they have all reached the same conclusions concerning the definition of man and the role of religion in the public sphere. In Islam, they contend, the realms of politics and religions are separate. God has created an autonomous and free-willed man, made him his lieutenant on earth, and endowed him with natural reason to take care of his worldly affairs. If we define secularism as a worldview that separates the religious sphere from the public sphere and advocates for the neutrality of state in religious affairs, we are now witnessing the development of a secularist, liberal, democratic theology in Shia Islam. This is a good news. However, how can we measure the impact of these four theologians, of whom one is dead, two are exiled, and the last one can hardly teach in Iran? How could they counter the regime's ideologues who are funded and have state media at their disposal to promote their totalitarian views? The behavior of the regime itself provides us with invaluable insight into the impact of the reformed Shia theology. First, the fact that the regime's ideologues are compelled to refute the reformers' theological arguments through numerous publications attests to their influence. Second, the regime's officials have time and again acknowledged the influence of reformed Shia theology within Iran's religious seminaries. The supreme leader keeps warning against forces that are trying to separate religious seminaries from the Islamic government. Since 2010, the supreme leader on numerous occasions has acknowledged the subversive impact of Shia reformers. I quote him, "Religious seminaries cannot be secular." He has warned, saying that we have nothing to do with the regime, we are not concerned with government issues, this is secularism, says Khamenei. He has also been lamenting the fact that the seminaries have not come up with religiously inspired economic and social programs to respond to modern society's needs. Khamenei's lieutenant regularly echoed these warnings. One member of the High Council of the Cultural Revolution, among many others, confesses that, I quote, "The roots of secularism are within religious seminaries. A canon law that does not think of creating institutions and is only concerned with individual transactions and worshipping is a secularist canon law. After 4 decades, he laments, we have not a single book on architecture from the standpoint of religious seminaries." Officials' confession of ideological impotence in social, cultural, economic, and political matters vindicate the theologians who promote a spiritual, non-political Islam. I could go on quoting officials' recurring warnings regarding the spread of secularism within Iran's Shia seminaries. However, these acknowledgements are not the only indicator of the spreading of the reformers' teaching. In January 2009, last month, Iran's Special Clerical Court defrauded Mullah Hassan Aghamiri, known as the Telegram cleric, and sentenced him to 2 years suspensive prison term. He was charged with insulting religious sanctities and disturbing the public mind, which he received for promoting Kadivar's merciful Islam. A very talented orator who addresses his audience with New Age music in the background, Aghamiri popularizes Kadivar's teaching and criticizes the clergy. He has 200,000 followers on Telegram and 1,300,000 on Instagram. Within a repressive regime, this is a notable social phenomenon, and it is important enough for the supreme leader to address it directly. In a speech refuting merciful Islam, Khamenei once again identifies it with American Islam. But this time he's more specific and points to American values. Those values and principles that George Washington, he mentions George Washington, and his friends established as the foundation of the United States. By mentioning the philosophical principles promoted by George Washington, Khamenei clarifies his understanding of American values. Merciful Islam, according to Khamenei, is neither merciful nor Islam. It's pure Western liberalism. The essence of the regime's Islam is the negation of the autonomous individual, and the essence of American Islam is the affirmation of individual freedom. Shia liberal theology has the merit of cornering revolutionary Islam and dialectically forcing it to acknowledge its own negative essence while confessing its own cultural and intellectual infertility. There is a reason why religious seminaries are so distancing themselves from the regime and paying attention to the few liberal theologians. It's because they see Iranians are losing faith in their fathers' religions. This disaffection has been an ongoing and developing phenomenon since the inception of the Islamic regime. In 2000, an official survey found that 75% of all Iranians and 86% of students did not say their prayers. By 2009, 50% of the country's mosques were inactive. Iranian society has not been passively waiting for Shia theology to reform itself. Religious dissidence is the most subversive form of dissent chosen by a considerable number of people. This dissent has partially manifested itself in trends of conversion and increased popularity of mysticism, Christianity, and Iran's ancient religion, Zoroastrianism. Islamic and non-Islamic mysticism is attracting many followers. Last year, in February, hundreds of Gunabadi Sufis confronted security forces to defend their spiritual leader. They openly profess a purely spiritual Islam and reject Velayat Faqih. Inspired by reformist theology, they promote human rights. The violent crackdown they have been subject to since the mid-1990s has not reduced their number. They claim 4 million followers. The regime's intelligence authorities warned that disillusioned former Hezbollah militants are attracted to Sufi denominations. Their loyalty to their leader is such that they do not fear confronting security forces to defend him. Obviously, we do not dispose of reliable statistics, but we know that Christian pastors have been among the victims of state violence since the early 1990s. Regime intelligence circles were the first to notice the danger, but executions and extrajudicial killing of Christians have not stopped the developing trend of conversion to Christianity. This trend has intensified since 2009. Estimates vary between 300,000 and over 1 million conversions. Some media in Iran have even alluded to 1,000 conversions per month. New converts go to neighboring country to be baptized. Given the climate of terror and intimidation, and considering the cultural obstacle to conversion, this trend is sociologically meaningful. Conversation with new converts shows that they are looking for a loving, peaceful God to replace the vengeful, violent God promoted by the regime. Nationalism and spontaneous conversion to real or imaginary Zoroastrianism are also areas of serious concern for the regime. In 1997, Ahmad Tafazzoli, one of the rare Iranian scholars familiar with Iran's ancient languages, was extrajudicially killed in Iran. In the early 2000s, four high-profile Iranian Zoroastrian notables were assassinated in France, Spain, and Tajikistan. All were active supporters of the Zoroastrian community in Iran. In 2016, thousands of people gathered at the tomb of Cyrus the Great and chanted, "Cyrus is our father, Iran is our motherland. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon. My life is for Iran. King of Iran, come back to your land." And freedom of thought is not possible with the mullahs. In retrospect, one can make sense of extrajudicial killings of Zoroastrian and scholars of ancient Iran. Once again, the regime sees the danger long before it can be publicly noticed. 300 participants in Cyrus Day celebration were arrested after this event, and 70 were sentenced from 1 to 7 years in prison. Khomeini abolished Iran's National Assembly and replaced it by an Islamic Assembly, making Iranian identity a secondary identity and Islam a primary identity. Iranians are reclaiming their national identity as their primary identity, and in so doing, they are contributing to the deepening of the regime's ideological crisis. Women were the first in 1979 to rise against Khomeini's totalitarian rule. They have been constantly challenging the regime's anti-women policies. They have been insulted, humiliated, flogged, jailed, fined, killed, only because they were fighting for their dignity and rights. They too have stopped addressing the regime to claim their rights. They have decided to take the matter in their own hands. Women from diverse array of economic, social, and religious background have joined a protest movement organized on social media where they remove their veil in public in defiance of the security forces and post pictures and videos of their disobedience on the internet. Their defiant act is politically and ideologically meaningful. By their very act, they disqualify the regime from imposing a dress code. They also disqualify it from interpreting religion for them or imposing a religious code upon them. Their civil disobedience is nothing short of enforcing a secularist worldview in the streets of Iran. The December 2017, January 2018 widespread popular protests were another testament to the failure of political Islam. Thousands of people poured onto the street of 80 cities, Iranian cities, to protest against the high cost of living, government corruption, and lack of freedom. They targeted government and religious buildings. This popular anger highlighted the regime's impotence regarding social, economic, and cultural issues. The protest also showed that the regime's ideology is completely rejected by the populace. Demonstrators chanted, "Our enemy is here, they lie when they say it's America." This was tantamount to a popular declaration of ideological war against the regime and represents an elevation in hostile discourse that supersedes that of the Green Movement of 2009. Calls for a secular republic or the return of the monarchy were also among the slogans chanted by protesters. The ensuing repression was ruthless. Amnesty International called 2018 the year of shame for Iran, with more than 7,000 arrests and a chilling crackdown. Today, as it turns 40, the Islamic regime of Iran is facing an unprecedented ideological crisis. Its violent apparatus has succeeded in maintaining it, but Iranian society seems to be shifted away from the regimes religiously, culturally, socially, and politically, as if society was seeking to reject the regime as a foreign occupier. And trust me, this is not a speculative conclusion. Isfahani farmers have literally staged it last year at the Friday prayer. Look at this event. Oh, I have to do something to, otherwise my research associate would be very angry. So. Now he's very angry. Come back. You need to come help me. This is the Friday prayer in Isfahan. The farmers went to the Friday prayer. They waited for the imam of the Friday prayer to come to the pulpit. And as soon as he arrives, you see, it's over there. Yeah. This is the pulpit, and the guy has just arrived to say the prayer, and all of a sudden they turned their back to the pulpit and said, our back to our enemies, our face to our motherland. And this is, I think, I'm not inventing this, this is what happens in Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ladan. That was a marvelously comprehensive account of the ideological scene, the legitimacy crisis in Iran. But let me pose a question that may have occurred to others too, is what could bring this legitimacy crisis to culminate in a change in the regime? I mean, you can say that the regime, it seems to me, has had three pillars: one of popular support, one of the clergy, and the third of security forces. And I think it's been apparent for a while that the popular support has waned. You make a very convincing case that if these new ideas are getting to the seminaries, that the clerical support is disappearing or dissipating as well. But what about the security forces? It seems to me that if there's going to be any real change, somehow the minds of the security forces will have to be altered. And I'm wondering if you could comment on whether you see any prospects of that taking place.
Well, first of all, I think the regime has always defined itself as an ideological regime. So an ideological crisis is fundamental for the... Now, the question is, where the security forces, the Revolutionary Guards or the Basijis, are part of the populations. And I think when the intelligence services were worried about the mystics, they were saying, these guys are our Hezbollahi kids are joining them. So they had really noticed that there are some doubts within themselves. In 2009, for instance, during the elections, many Revolutionary Guards voted for the reformists. So I think when you see how these people recruit the Basijis on the internet, you see they provide them with a lot of material advantages. It's not by faith in an ideology. It's a question of interest. So for the political click to happen, you need a moment that these people think their interest is to go to the other side. I believe. Now, also you see on the political scene, people are being very active. They are organizing. They are talking to each other. New organizations are emerging. But for me, it's important to see, because what we didn't see that was announcing the happening of the Islamic Revolution was the pre-revolutionary ideological changes that had happened in the Iranian societies. Different forms of totalitarian ideologies had taken over everyone's mind, from the intellectual close to the court to the revolutionary guerrilla people. Nobody was thinking, nobody believed in liberal democracy at the time, and nobody paid attention to this situation. What I think that how things will happen in the event situation will really depend on, the conditions for a collapse are there, ideologically, economically, socially, morally. Now, how it will be triggered, it can survive with just pure violence for a long time. I can't tell you.
That's what I was going to suggest. That I certainly recognize the importance of ideology for these kinds of regimes, but there are certainly other cases where that legitimacy seems to have been lost, certainly in the Soviet Union and so on, but the regime nonetheless stumbles ahead. Venezuela perhaps would be another example where the ideological attachment certainly is weaker, but a combination of material advantages.
Yeah, but they don't have money. They are short of money. I'm sure if the money pours in, they will be able to strengthen their violent apparatus. But what we see every day, and I shared it with Jeremy Langlois today, there was this video of a woman who followed a mullah who had, she said he had hit her because of her veil issues. And all of a sudden, scores of people gathered around the mullah and started to say, why did you hit her? You didn't have to. It was so frightening. I thought they were going to lynch the mullah. They didn't. And one person was trying to defend him, saying that the lady was lying. But it seems to me also there is a psychological warfare here. The regime is scared. The population is scared. And the question is, which part will realize that they are stronger and stop being scared? And it seems to me, I have the indications that the ordinary people are less and less scared. That's...
And you spoke in your first response to me about not knowing what a trigger might be. But let me ask, some people have speculated that Khamenei is old and in ill health, and that while the regime survived the death of its founder, Khomeini, as supreme leader, that the next opportunity to choose a new supreme leader could lead to real fissures within the ruling establishment. Do you see that as a key turning point, or?
It might be. This requires a precise studies of the factional interaction within the regime. What I can tell you, just as an indication, that when this Aghamiri, the Telegram mullah, was defrocked, commentaries from the religious circles were not very enthusiastic. People did say that this is the only way we can keep. So it seems to me, and that's why I thought the dissidence of religious seminaries could be very important, because a regime could be 200 years old, but the religious institution is more than 1,000 years old. So they are thinking differently. And they may kind of empty the back of the regime. And then I don't know how it will stand on its feet, really, because it doesn't have the people. The socialist character has disappeared long time ago. The religious character is disappearing. It's going to, logically, it should collapse. Unless Russia keeps it up, because Russian support is very important.
One last question before I open it to the audience, which is this question of nationalism. You indicated that, in one sense at least, the regime has resisted defining itself in a national way, has defined itself as the regime of Shiite Islam rather than of the Iranian motherland. Is that something that could be changing? Can the regime try to draw on the resources of nationalism as some other regimes, China, for example, which has also a problem of a certain legitimacy crisis, has increasingly gone to that resource?
Yeah, I mean, part of maybe some factions within the regime could just get rid of this religious leg and turn into a proto-fascist nationalist, and this is my biggest worry right now, because if we were in the early 1990s, liberal democracy was all the best. I mean, that was the only option. But now in the political marketplace, we have different options, and they are not all good options. And nationalist tendencies I can see in this social media, it goes very quickly towards anti-Arabs, anti-Sunnis, anti-racist tendencies have existed always within Iranian societies, and this could be exasperated. But the good news is, well, it's maybe not even the good news, because our Shia reformers are referring to liberal democracy as the closest to Islamic ideals. But again, if we are in a reactionary attitude, they would also reject religion anyways. So it won't save. That is the worrisome part of the situation.
Okay, let's give everyone else a chance. Manaz first, and then George.
I want to thank you, Ladan.
Why don't you please identify yourself for the benefit of the audience?
I think it's working, isn't it? Yeah. I'm Manaz Afghami, president of Women's Learning Partnership, and an admirer of the forum and of Ladan specifically. And I really think your presentation was amazing, very, very illuminating. I just wanted to ask you, you discussed the various shades of interpretation and belief that is going on. And you also, I think, referred to other types of parallel interests of the Iranian people historically. Do you think if we were to look at nationalism, not in the way we are seeing it in general globally, a kind of patriotism which is combined with right-wing types of exclusionary behavior, but look at it in the way that it has been known in Iran, and you referred to that, I think. That is, Iran being a country that took 300 years from the Arab conquest to actually take on Islam. It was 300 years of struggle before Iranians became Muslims. Prior to that, for a long period of time, there were a series of cultural, religious, and historical belief systems and values that people believed in. And these two were parallel even after Islam became the national religion, so to speak. So do you think encountering the various shades of Islam, which probably, as you mentioned, people will reject all of it, from liberal to conservative, once a possibility of change happens. Do you think that alternative that people seem to be grasping for, that is the pre-Islamic civilization history, imagined some of it. Is that something that they might look back to? And also, you referred to something that is very important to some of us, and that's the women who have been the most active, really, in demonstrations. How do you see their position as change comes, which seems to be inevitable? Thank you.
Shall I
You want to
respond?
take that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Maharaj. Actually, you know, there is a sort of the search of Iranian identity, and also there is a tendency towards Zoroastrianism. You can even see this in the Iraqi Kurdistan, where it's not forbidden. People are converting to Zoroastrianism, and people it seems that they are creating also a crisis within the Zoroastrian religion, because it was a closed religion, it was not opening, and now everyone is reinventing Zoroastrianism. It's kind of a mess. It's a mess also in Christian circles, because there cannot be, everything is underground. It's a little bit messy, but I would see people would be very interested in exploring and developing pre-Islamic culture. They will do that. They are doing it anyways. So if things change, we can see really the religious fabric of Iran changing, to have numerous different religions, and somehow there would be no major big religion. But I think everybody would agree to push aside religion from politics. That is a complete consensus. And now regarding the women, I think women, right now, it is women who are mustering men in the streets. So it's always the women who starts the protest, and then men slowly gathers around it. And it took a while, actually, because they were alone first. But now, more and more in the videos that we see, I don't know how, it's also, we have to be careful with what we see. It could be our own echo chamber. So we are really speculating and conjecturing based on the indications that we have. But it seems to me that women are really leading the protest in breaking the fear among men. And this is amazing.
George.
Thank you. My name is George Sapon, and I'm Ladan's fellow. Congratulations for such a brilliant job. You really helped me to understand the issues. But I have a very small question. When you talk of the reformist clerics, you indicate their belief in the autonomy of man, their capacity to discover issues through rational reasoning. Who is this man that they believe in? Does that man include women?
Yes.
Does that man include gays? In other words, are they reformists? How liberal are their reform orientation? Are they reformists only in opposition to the religious orthodoxy of Iran, or you think they represent true liberal alternatives to the system? Thank you.
Shall I respond? This is, I anticipated this question and I tried to mention it, but I'm going to develop this. It's a very good question, actually. The man is the generic man, human being. It includes women, it includes gays, it includes heretics, that's why he said no one has the right to punish here on behalf of God apostasy and heresy and blasphemy, because these are what is interesting with the new reformist trend, because Khomeini in a way was also a reformist, but he was a traditionalist reformist. So what he would do, he would suspend, based on his quality of imam and ijtihad, some of the things that was not suitable to him. He would suspend these Sharia rules and regulation, but he wouldn't face them. And in that respect, he was still traditionalist. These guys are facing, how do you say, face on, heads on. The issues. So they were talking about women, they were talking about gays, they were talking, and basically they say, even if there is a promise of punishment in the other worlds, we are not competent in doing this. This is not our job. And at the end of the day, man or human being, let's say, because a human being is free to choose what he believes in. And that makes this religion, Abrahamic religion. Otherwise, the whole setup of the other world, the paradise and the punishment doesn't make sense. They say if the God wanted it, he would have created everyone Muslims. He didn't need to ask them. So he has created them free.
And Carl?
Congratulations, Ladan. Mark referred to possible splits in the, if they're choosing a new leader. But could you talk about splits now within the Revolutionary Guard or elsewhere, political splits that you understand? And can you say why there are these splits, where the dissent is it becoming? I mean, you didn't really talk about economic failure, but from what we understand, the regime is failing very badly economically, and does that have something to do with the splits?
Well, honestly, I can't tell you about, because these are, you need insiders' information to know exactly what's going on. But the question is that the Revolutionary Guards over the decades have taken the control of the economic Iran's economy. So I haven't seen any split within them, or I haven't seen it. I don't know, because I'm focused on the ideological aspects. Maybe someone else who in the assistance could help, but I haven't seen major split yet within Revolutionary Guards that could be the sign of a fight within the regime. I haven't seen that yet.
Abe Shulsky, and then
Hi, Abe Shulsky from Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for the talk. When you discuss the religious landscape in Iran, you mentioned the believers in Velayat-e Faqih on the one hand, maybe fewer and fewer of them, and then what seems some very sort of liberal, reformist religious thinkers. I was just wondering, is there anything left of traditional Shiism? Are there quietists? Are there people who would look to, say, Sistani as what an Ayatollah ought to be, and do they have any possibility of having any impact in the society?
Actually, thank you for the question. Actually, I didn't divide them between reformists and the partisan of the Velayat Faqih. I think the vast majority of the Ayatollahs are quietist, and that's what makes this guy, the regime Ayatollahs, very angry, because they say, you're always saying this is not our business. But their problem, they are still the majority of the seminaries, the quietists. But the question of the quietists facing the society is that they don't have an answer to people's questions. Because if they are traditionalists, they say, they put you in a situation that either you cover yourself, you take half of when your parents die, you get only half of the inheritance, or your life is worth half of the life of a man. Either you accept that, or you don't accept it, you become modern, and you keep your religion, but you are sinning. And the quietists say, we won't punish you, we don't want power, but they put you in a schizophrenic moral situation Whereas what I found interesting within these new ones is that with the structural jihad, and it has become progressively, and the early 1990s, they were still hesitating. But now they see people are leaving Islam. I mean, we have Iranians who are devil worshipping. They are so disgusted with God and everything. Even Soroush's son-in-law had been arrested and tortured and has told to Soroush, where was this God when they were putting me naked and torturing me? I mean, they are really scared to lose, their faithful. So yes, the majority is quietist. You have a small minority that is real reform liberal theology, is reinventing a form of liberal theology. But I asked one of them that I was interviewing, I asked, what is your impact? And he was very modest. He said, we are very small, but slowly our ideas are finding a space within the traditionalist seminaries. The younger generation is much more open to our teachings. He said, I receive from the Hosa, from the religious seminaries, 20 emails per day asking questions, exchanging. Or he says, I published a book, I put a photo of an Ayatollah, and from one of the major religious teachers, Marja, he sent me an email saying, this guy is not the one who you say. So he said, I realized that even the grand Ayatollahs are reading my book because he realized that the photo was a wrong photo. So basically, things are moving, and when I myself, I hadn't made the connection, but when this mullah, Agha Miri, the telegram mullah, was defrocked, I started to listen to his preaching, and I realized he is really teaching in a very popular fashion all the teachings of Mohsen Kadivar, and Kadivar didn't tell me that, because he was trying to be very modest, or maybe he hasn't listened to them, but he's using his teachings. So I think it's the more the crisis is deep, the more ears they will find within traditional seminaries.
Yeah, there you go.
Thanks a lot, Ladan, once more. This is Duygu Güvenç from Turkey, a journalist. And as a journalist, I'm going to ask with respect to the recent developments and how you evaluate, or have you ever seen previous examples? I'm sure you have heard about it. The foreign minister, who has been serving for 6 years, had resigned, and later on Rouhani rejected. But it showed something, at least, that there is a split also within the administration. First of all, am I right? How do you evaluate it? And have you ever seen such kind of splits within the administration level? I mean, maybe it might be sometimes with the revolutionary guards, maybe sometimes with the president and the rulers. Thanks.
Okay, maybe we should take a couple more now, because it's getting a little bit late. See one in the back, and then Azor.
Charles Fairbanks, Hudson Institute. You talked about religious currents of new thinking, but less about irreligious or very heterodox religious thinking, which particularly in Azerbaijan and the Gilan and Mazandaran has a very old tradition that radical forms of faith like the Hurufis and so forth were very dominant there. What has happened to that? Was that all overcome by the modernization of Iran, or is a kind of are there also atheist responses as well as Zoroastrian, Christian a liberal Muslim, and so forth.
Azar. Up front. So we're taking a few questions now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ladan, for a very thought-provoking and enlightening lecture. I always believe that Iran is like the Soviet Union of what we call the Muslim world, that they theorized the Islamic fundamentalism, and the failure of Iran is failure of that ideology. And I was you mentioned the influence of Marxism on the Iranian Revolution, and I think that this is a very important response to both regimes, ideologues, and their apologists, who keep portraying the Islamic Revolution as a fight between tradition and history, as opposed to westernization and imperialism. While it seems, or does it seem to be more a fight between two modern trends, totalitarianism versus liberalism, and they both are within the modernist tradition? And if so, could you elaborate a little bit on the other side, the liberal aspects of the Iranian society that has been standing up to the Islamic regime? There seems to be really roots in this form of thought that is standing up in terms of women and culture and minorities. So could you just elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
Okay. All right, one last one. Two last ones.
Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute. Thank you, Ladan. The question I have is about something you said earlier about the kinds of reflections that are going on within some of the clergy. And I thought I understood you to say that some want to argue now that liberal democracy would capture the essence of Islam or Shiite Islam. I was just wondering what that argument looks like and what its bases are.
And then last one, gentleman just in front.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Majidar. I am currently the director of Iran program at the Middle East Institute. I have two questions, but related about the protest movement. When the anti-government protests broke out in December and January 1 year ago, the vast majority of the Iranian middle class, particularly in bigger cities like in Tehran, they did not join the protest movement. Those were I'm talking about those people who are making the bulk of the 2009 protests. Why do you think that they did not join? Was it because they feared that if they joined the protest movement, the Revolutionary Guards and the state would use that as an excuse to further militarize the society and take away the very few freedoms that they have? Or perhaps because another slogan was that by some reformers in Tehran that we don't want to become another Syria. And do you think that that could change? And if so, what could trigger that change? And second part of the question is that you mentioned about the legitimacy of the crisis of legitimacy by the regime, particularly amongst the young people, that about 70% of the Iranian population, they are under the age of 35. So they were not born at the time of revolution. They even do not have any memories of the Iran-Iraq war, that nationalism or religious fervor. So that kind of challenge, what's just the solution that the regime is seeking? Is it, could we see more kind of repression to deal with that? Or you think that the regime could perhaps allow some social freedoms, even if they are cosmetic and temporary, to diffuse tension?
Thank you. Well, that's a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
Why don't you?
Yeah. Okay. Let's get the hurufi out of the the way first, Charles. This is an interesting question. as you remember, I took state violence as my indicator of religious dissidence. I haven't come across Hurufis organizing or being, but I guess, you know, the debate that were when the Sufis had the confrontation with the regime, in their discussion, they were saying that the natural constituencies of different Sufi and mystical schools in Iran is about 20 million people. And these 20 million people, he was saying, in Baluchistan, in Kurdistan, in many regions of Iran, people are culturally, that's their religion. That has been their religious tradition. And I think it's true. And if there is freedom, we would see this organizing. And so there is a remarkable constituency of non-fanatic religious spiritualist groups culturally rooted within Iran. And even my interlocutor, clergyman, was telling that he sees also a very important tendency towards mysticism because, and it has happened under when the Mongols invaded Iran, in time of crisis, people are prone to go towards this kind of spiritual solutions. Otherwise, my indicator, state violence, has not shown me any Hurufi issues, but maybe they exist. I can't tell you. I haven't seen them expressing as a social force of dissent, but maybe they are there. Now, Duygu, regarding Zarif and the split within the regime, you know, there has always been a tension between the executive and the leadership. And this is a natural way in totalitarian system. Those who have the power and have to ideologically adapt the regime come to a confrontation with those who have to administer the reality, because reality is always rebelling against the totalitarian tendencies. So we had this from day one in Iran. The leadership and the government had always tension with Bazargan, with Bani Sadr, with every single one of them, with Mousavi as a prime minister, and with even Rouhani, even with someone like Ahmadinejad, who came to power in order to create a fusional relationship with the leadership. During his second term, they couldn't even talk to each other, because there is always a structural issue between the two, the power that administers reality and the power that has to make sure that everything is in tune with the ideological requirements of the. So Zarif issues I read before coming in is that maybe it's because he was not admitted to the meeting with Rouhani and Assad, and so he was just angry because they didn't take him seriously. It might be this, but there is always a tension between the executive and the leadership. Now, on the liberal side of the society, that's Azar Nafisi. Yes, we have seen, especially since the you know, as I know, that Iranian intelligentsia were not democratic, liberal democratic in 1979. What the good news was that with the fall of the Soviet Union, all the intelligentsia that were fascinated by socialist totalitarian ideology started to convert to liberal democracy and human rights. And during the Khatami era, we had the chance of having a space where these groups started to work, to interact with the younger generation, and we have now a civil society that is very focused on human rights and democracy. And these are the activists we know, women rights activists, human rights activists. We have one of the Iran-born groups that is the most important here. So that was a very good news. We had Kurds who set up their human rights organization, whereas the Kurdish dissidents was a violent one before. So we would see the changing of the landscape with the development of liberal democracy globally. But unfortunately, I see now a reversal too. With the rise of authoritarianism, discourses, more authoritarian, more fascist discourse, you can hear them. They are echoed in, and this is what worries me. Now the question is, these liberal democratic forces that were born and active during Khatami's period and strongly repressed afterward, and they paid, and they are, many of them are outside the country now, will they have the strength in case of the situation change to regroup quickly and monopolize or, you know, take the upper hand in the social discourse regarding change? Or will we have violent nationalist groups who will emerge and provide make for a perspective that is not so glorious for the future? I am worried about that, but I hope they will, the old generation and the new generation of human rights activists will join forces to counter these extremist ideological tendencies. This is my hope. Now, the other question about Hiller's liberal democracy. Yes, it's very interesting. Their argument, one of them tried to create, to invent a political philosophy based on Islam. This is Khairi Yazdi. But the others says that because they don't bother to have their own political philosophy. They say, as we use antibiotics, democracy and liberal democracy are what humanity has found for now best to meet the requirement of natural justice that, according to Islamic teaching, is the ultimate goal of body politics. So we are taking it. That's how they reason. Both Kadivar and Soroush, that's the way they reason.
So liberal democracy is an antibiotic.
Yeah, it's the social antibiotics against for now, and they say if there is better, we will take better. But we, as Muslim, we don't. It's not our duty to provide you with. We will go with what humanity has created, invented best at the time we are talking. And middle class. Middle class, Iranian middle class. This is the middle class that made the revolution, actually, and now it's not doing its part for changing things. In their discourse, you mentioned it both. They are a little bit, they are afraid of violence and repression, but also they are more sensitive to the regime's propaganda that it's going to be Syria or Iraq, but they forget that the regime is the element that is creating Syria, and so it's really a vicious circle intellectually. And when you talk to them, my thing is that they fear because they don't know what's coming afterward. They don't know the alternative. They just fear. I think, and the day they see a valid alternative, they may join, whereas the others, they don't know how to feed their children. So, you know, they are out in the streets. And since last January, there was not one day we didn't have a demonstration. And I'm really stunned by the Western media that do not cover these issues, because every day people are demonstrating, every day.
I think that perhaps is a good note on which to conclude. Our time is up. Please join me in thanking Ladan for a great presentation.